over to you, Hannah.
Okay, hi everyone. So the single central record is a central record of the safeguarding checks that have been carried out on all staff and other relevant people. So all schools must have a single central record. It's required by the Department of Education, and we use it to log for employees all their pre-employment checks, but also all the checks that we conduct on volunteers, governors, agency staff, contractors. So the people that should be included on a single central record are, let me just bring my list up. So all staff that are employed directly by the school, any volunteer who's in regular activity, brought into the activities, additional teaching or instruction, so music teachers, sport people, supply teachers. So supply teachers can do one of two of the tabs. If they are not with an agency, then they can they will appear on the employees tab, but they will be specified as supply. If they are with an agency, they'll go into the agency tab. We also have contracted staff, so cleaners, electricians, caterers, also governors. And it does specify that we should have trustees, which we do have, being an academy. However, they don't feature on the individual school single central records. We actually hold a central one for the central team, and the board will appear on that one, the trustee. So they will, anytime we have an inspection, they will actually, if they want to see that, I'll have that information available because I'll be at all Ofsted inspections. So people that don't need to appear on the single central record are ad hoc visitors, people that are just visiting for a day. If it's just like a one-off visit, say you had to get an emergency plumber, and they haven't got a DBS, then that's absolutely fine. They don't need to appear on the single central record. However, they will need to be supervised at all times because we haven't got those reassurances through the DBS checks. Parents coming in for sports day, things like that, they don't need to appear. Work experience students that are under the age of 16, they don't need to go on a single central record. As I said, contractors that we have, a lot of groundsmen will come in, ground workers will come in weekends, evenings, when the school's not open to complete their work. If they're not coming in when the school is open and children are on site, they don't need to go on a single central record. And also, if your school lets out your venue, say school hall, and it's, you know, like an external club, use your facilities, as long as the school is not open and the children are not there, they don't need to appear on the single central record either. Okay. So Ian, if you could bring up the template that we use, what I'll do is I'll go through each tab, starting with the employees, and then I'll finish at the end. And if you have any questions regarding that tab, if you could ask them at the end, then between me and Ian, we'll be happy to answer those for you. So with the identity checks, the first thing that we need to put on single central record under employees is obviously their name, their address, and their date of birth. That's standard. Other checks that we need to complete are the dates that we've seen their ID, their address ID, and also their photo ID. This information is captured when we do their DBS appointment to verify who they are, that they are who they say they are. Most people will use a passport, a driving license, and a bank statement in order to fulfill this requirement. You need 3 documents. Some people don't have the required documents, and if this happens, then what we have to do is we have to do an external validation check, which the person is required to write down, complete a big form with lots of information. That will then go to our Devon Safer recruitment team, and they'll do that external check to make sure that that is the person that they say they are. So when we see that photo ID and the proof of address, we put the date into the single central record, as you can see under column D and E. And we would also ask that you make a note, just insert a comment to say what proof you've seen. So if it's a bank statement for your address, their address, just pop in that you've seen their bank statement. And again, the same with photo ID, passport, driving license. So all the checks that are going, all the dates that are required in the single central record tab should all predate their date started with school. So that the date started with school should be the most current date. Everything should be completed before they start in that school. So if we could just move along a little bit, please, Ian. Okay, so we've got position held. The reason the position is so important to have, and why Ofsted want to know what role they have within the school, is because different positions require different checks. Teachers and head teachers require proof to be seen for their qualifications, their teaching qualifications, and also they are subject to prohibition checks. Also, senior leadership and head teachers, again, they're subject to a S128 check, which I'll explain a bit further on. So with qualifications, when you're a teacher, we need proof that you are qualified as a teacher. So we need to see their PGCE or their degree, and we need to make a note of what information we've seen. We need to take a copy of that, and that needs to be placed in their personnel file. Going forward, obviously, recruitment is held within HR, and I do all this work, and all this evidence is recorded and placed in their electronic personnel file. We also like to note their teacher number, so we can do the prohibition checks. So a prohibition check is to make sure that they're not prohibited from teaching. And the way that we complete this is we sign into the DFE sign-in, go into the employer teacher checks services, and there it will let you check that teacher. You need their teacher number and also their date of birth, and that will bring up that teacher, and it will have an alerts column at the top and also on the last page, and that will let you know if they've got any alerts. I've never seen one with an alert, but that's not to say that they're not there. So we always have to check that it says none against the alerts, and that they're, who they say they are. Good practice for this is to then print that off. It's a printer-friendly document, so you can print that off and place that in their personnel file. Going forward, like I say, that will be in all personnel files. So yeah, we just need to date and evidence that we've done those relevant checks. Again, worth mentioning is if you have a person applying for a TA role, but you see on their application that they're actually qualified as a teacher as well, you still have to make those checks. You still need to see that evidence that they were a qualified teacher, and make those prohibition checks. Something that for me, I'm always within safer recruitment, I'm always looking for little flags, and there's plenty of teachers that decide they'd rather be a teaching assistant, and that's absolutely fine, but it's something that we do check just to make sure that they're actually not prohibited from working, from teaching. So we will still make those checks even though they're not actually applying for a teacher position. If you could move the screen along, please, Ian. Okay, so the update service, this is something that is a really useful thing to have when we go into the other tabs, and the information regarding the update service is it's for employees, it's £13 a year to subscribe to the update service. And what happens is you go through the DBS process, you receive your DBS certificate in the post. if you want, within 30 days of receiving that DBS certificate, you can then sign up for the update service. And that's £13 a year. And it means that you don't need to get another DBS, especially if you were to leave the organisation and move to another organisation, and they also require a DBS for that role. You can just give them the update number, your certificate number, your date of birth, and your surname, and they can check against that. So they don't have to then go through the whole process again. As I mentioned, you only have a 30-day window from when your DBS is issued to actually sign up for that service. And I'll go into a little bit more about that regarding volunteers and governors as we go on to that tab. So the next section is, if you could just move along a little bit, thank you, Ian, is the right to work. So recently this has changed. Right to work, for every person coming into the trust, when they're invited to interview, the HR administrators will, when they're inviting them to interview, they'll request that they bring a right to work document. If you are British born, then the evidence that you would use is passport, driving license, you know, those kind of things, birth certificate. If they're not British born, then it's just to make sure that they do actually have a right to work in the UK. The evidence for this is different depending on the country, and it shouldn't put people off, you know, applying, and it shouldn't also put recruiters off by taking these people on. Jo Evans, the CEO, was on the previous one, and she said we need the best candidate regardless of, you know, where they've come from or their background. So I will deal with all of the kind of getting right to work documents. So all the recruitment people, all the schools need to concentrate on is getting the best person in that role. So if they do have a work permit, we would then need evidence of that. We'd take a copy, it'd be put in the personnel file. Some visas and work permits have expiration dates, so we would also note that, because we need to then be mindful of that when recruiting, but also if we do recruit them, we need to be mindful to check that this has been extended when that comes up for renewal. Additional checks for staff either coming in or staff that are British born and they've worked abroad within the last 5 years. We need to get some overseas checks to make sure that it's called almost like a good conduct certificate. And what we do during the DBS process, it asks you to list your addresses within the last 5 years. If you've been abroad for 6 months or more within the last 5 years, we're required to do additional checks. So dependent on which country they've been in, that all depends on the kind of checks that we're requesting that they complete. It is on the new employee to get those checks through, and depending on the country, some are really quick. France has usually got about a week's turnaround, and most European countries do. Some other countries are really difficult, but again, don't let that put you off recruiting them, because I'll be working with the Devon Safer recruitment team. If we can't get those checks through, there are additional checks that we can do instead. And then we would be noting the checks when they have come through and what we've done in that box in the column U. And we'll also have a copy of the information in the personnel file. Okay, so moving on to medical. Everyone that comes into the trust as an employee is required to complete a medical check. This is to make sure that they're fit for the role and they're able to do the role, but also it's to highlight if they do have any medical issues and maybe need certain things put in place ready for their start date, then we're aware of it and we can make it as seamless as possible for them to come in and be comfortable in their new role. If anything does get flagged on their medical check, a report will be sent to me, and then I will then forward that on to the head teacher for them to put those additional things in place ready for that person to start, but also to make a decision as to whether they are able to complete the role. So section 128 checks. This is something that most people know about, but they don't really know what they are. So the section 128 check, we would complete these for anyone that's involved in the school management. So it's a check with a direction that prohibits or restricts a person from taking part in the management of schools. So if they appear on the list, they wouldn't then be able to take up that role. So we make checks to make sure that they're not on the list. So the people that are covered that we need to complete these checks for are trust members and trustees, governors, and that's all governors, not just the chair of governors, staff engaged in management positions. So management positions are head teachers, teaching positions on a senior leadership team, teaching positions that carry out a departmental headship, but also people that are making financial decisions regarding the school. So previously we had business managers, they would be subject to an S128 check. And the way that we complete these is, again, like the prohibition checks, we go on to the DFE sign-in. We then go to the employers section for teacher services, and then just to the right of the teacher services check, you'll see it says S128 check barring list, and we would then go on and you'll put in the surname of the person. That will bring up anyone with the same surname, and you just make sure that that person that you're the governor or head doesn't appear on that list. It's not a massive list, it's about 30 people, there's not many people on it, so it's a really quick and easy check. And once you've completed that, just put that you've completed that check and then enter a comment to say the date. So the second to last part is references. References are something that I'm sure most administrators and head teachers find difficult trying to get them back, depending on the role. Going forward, obviously HR will be responsible for getting those references back, and we will forward those on to the head teachers or to whoever's responsible for that recruitment for them to check that they're satisfactory. And we need at least 2 references for them to be able to start satisfactory references. So once we've got those through, we will date to say that we've got them, and then they'll be placed in their personnel files. Something that Ofsted have recently been checking is they'll look at the applicant's application form, see who they've noted down as referees, and then check to see whether that application form with the referees correspond with the references that we do have. If for any reason we didn't get those references back for those people mentioned, then it's just kind of noting or having an audit trail to say why, and just to reassure you that HR are doing that with the recruitment process, and that will be held within their file. If you don't have references for historic cases, you may see on the single central record that it says RA. That's where we've completed a risk assessment. References are relatively, well, not relatively new, but within the last 5 years, it's something that's required that wasn't previously so heavily kind of sought after. So the kind of rule is anything after 2016, we should have 2 references. If we don't have references, then we should try to seek those references. If we've exhausted all options and we can't, then we can complete a risk assessment. Although really we should be, anyone going forward, we will have references for. Risk assessments have been completed for people pre-2016. And this is where the head teacher will complete a risk assessment based on the information that we've got about the employee, and it's almost like a matrix. So it will tell you whether this person is low, medium or high risk, because we're missing those references. And then there may be suggestions of what you can do. And the most common one is to re-DBS that person. So we would complete a new DBS just to satisfy ourselves that there's no risk posed. And then the last column Z, is evidence checked by. Going forward in this tab, it will have my name in it, but any previous ones, obviously that will be the people that have previously done those checks. It's really important that that is completed, and it is a requirement by Ofsted that that is completed. Okay, does anyone have any questions regarding that section?
Yeah, feel free to use the chat or just pop back on the screen and ask any questions. Really helpful summary, thank you. But I recognise that some people are hearing that for the first time. So any questions from the room?
No.
I'm just gonna mention those risk assessments again, because that does come up, thinking about some of the governors or leaders when they're checking. What should people expect to see recorded on a risk assessment, Hannah?
So they should expect to see what information is missing from that personnel file, and then with regards to the missing information, what the head teacher has done in order to reassure themselves that that person doesn't pose a risk. So you can never be 100% sure that that person doesn't pose a risk, but we need to ensure that we're diligent in our checks, and that if we're missing information, the best thing to do, just do another DBS check, just do a new one. Most of these occur with historic employees that have been at the school for a long time. So actually it's quite good practice to re-DBS people after a period of time anyway, because we don't currently have our employees subscribing to the update service. But anyone that hasn't seen the risk assessment matrix, that needs to see it, then we can send that over so they've got a guide.
Yeah, it's about reducing the risk, isn't it? And I think when this first came up a few years ago, things happened like people giving out application forms to people who'd been there for 20 years. It's not about covering your tracks, it's about what you can do to reduce the risk. So thank you for that. A question from Cheryl. You mentioned supply teachers. Are these long-term supplies? That's a good question, isn't it? Because sometimes you might only see a supply teacher once, sometimes you might see them quite often. How would they be captured on the single central record?
So with the supply teacher, if they have a supply contract with the school, which they all should now, I know HR have been working quite hard on getting supply set up on payroll, then they should appear on the single central record. If we're paying them directly, they should appear on the single central record under the employees tab. If they haven't been in within the last 3 months, and they've said that, or they've said they're no longer interested in, providing supply, then you can remove them. If they do say they no longer want to do supply at your school, you remove them, and then after 3 months, if that period of time has passed and they change their mind, you have to go through the whole process again. Supply staff that don't inform you that they're no longer available for supply can sit on that DBS on our single central record, but we would recommend that they subscribe to the update service because of the period of time that can sometimes happen from when you call them in for 1 month and then you don't see them for 5 or 6 months because there's no requirement. So with supply teachers, we would ask if they, could subscribe to the update service. And I'm sure most would be happy to, because then they don't have to go through the process for each school that they go to.
Yeah, brilliant. And people from Hayes or Supply Plus, that will come under another tab, won't it?
Yeah, that can under agencies.
I see Emma's popped up. Is that because you've got a question, Emma?
I did. I want to apologise first of all, because a lot of people might know this, but I kind of just sort of missed, Hannah, you explaining what your job role was, and you were saying there were a number of things on the record that you'd be responsible for checking and for filling in. So presumably you work trust-wide, is that right?
Yeah, so my role is HR coordinator. So I get involved in the recruitment process once that person's been offered a position. At that point, I'll then complete all the safer recruitment checks that's required for them to start. And so every column that you can see that we've just gone through on the single central record, I'll be gathering all of that information and filling that in once that check's complete. And then only when everything's filled in and all the checks have come back completed, would I advise the school that that person is then ready to start.
Okay, and then maintaining the record, presumably the school then they then take on the responsibility for keeping that up to date, but you're sort of there when it's a new person being employed, is that right?
So in terms of the employee tab, which is the first tab that we've just gone through, I actually have the responsibility for maintaining that tab. So when people leave the trust, I'm notified. And then I'll remove them off the single central record, and I do that for all schools within the trust. So it's a relatively new thing that we're doing. We've been doing it for the last 6 months, but actually it's proved quite beneficial because as I know from working in schools, in the school office, it's incredibly busy and things can sometimes get forgotten, whereas they don't have to worry about that because I'll be doing all of that and communicating with head teachers to let them know that when checks have been completed. So it's quite a robust process.
That sounds like a great idea. Thank you for explaining.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks for your questions, Emma. Sorry, my fault for not introducing Hannah properly at the start. Question from Amy about would the centre consider having a supply bank for the MAP? I think that's worth thinking about. We do have particular agencies in the different regions that schools will tend to use. I see what Hannah's view is. My view is that if we did that, then we would have to be taking responsibility to recruit all those people, check them, supervise them. So yeah, there's flip sides. Have you got a view on that, Hannah?
It is a good suggestion that maybe within the areas we could have a bank of staff, and it's something that we could potentially look at in the future. At the moment, we're still in our embedding stage of the central department, so we want to get everything working as well as possible, and then we can look to kind of extending that. So that would be a really good suggestion for us to look at in the future.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the questions. And let's move on to the next tab.
Okay, so the next tab, when it appears, is the volunteers and governors section. So with this section, the responsibility, which Ian will go into in more depth later on, actually lies with the schools themselves. So obviously the head teacher has overall responsibility for the single central record, but generally they ask the administration teams within the schools to complete the single central record for volunteers and governors, contractors and agency. So we'll be concentrating at the moment on the volunteers and governors. So again, you have the same system for DBSs. You evidence that you've seen their address and their ID. With volunteers and governors, we would request that when you're completing the DBS checks, which will be done by the administration staff within schools, that they keep a copy of those documents that they've used for the purposes of proving their identity for the DBS. These should be kept within a folder. You can either decide to move your governors and volunteers folders onto the SCR Teams channel that each school have now, which is where the single central record sits, and also new employees, their files sit there as well. Or you can decide to keep them in paper copy within schools. Once you complete the DBS process, you'll receive a clearance email from Employment Check to state that that person's clear. It will give you an issue date and also the DBS certificate number. We would request that you also print this email off and keep it with the ID to prove that you've completed that process for that governor or that volunteer. So volunteers and governors sit under the same tab, but they are slightly different. So volunteers are subject to, if I could just ask, that's perfect, thank you. Again, we want the position held to be completed. Again, the reason is so that Ofsted, when they're looking at it, and other people that are checking the single central record, can make sure that the right checks have been completed for that role. With volunteers, when we do the DBS process, we're also checking for the barred list check for children. When you complete a DBS application, it's done through a portal online, and you're telling the portal what you want it to check. So all of our checks are enhanced DBSs, but all our employees are also subject to be checked against the barred list for children, so they're not barred from working with children. So volunteers, because they're in regular activity with children, are subject to this check, and so therefore we can select that option on the DBS. Again, with governors, they're not in regular activity with children, they're much more of a management role. You can sometimes have governors that may volunteer in schools, so if that's the case, you would log that person, you would do the DBS, but you would log it separately as a volunteer on the single central record and as a governor, and complete the relevant information. So in section J, in column J, you'll see that a volunteer has had a barred list check, but a governor hasn't. And that's the reasons why, because governors generally don't work, have regular activity with children. So once you've completed those checks, you would then enter in their DBS certificate. Before that person comes into school and has, unsupervised access to the school and is able to freely walk around, you need to see their DBS certificate. Although you'll receive a clearance email, you actually need to make sure that you see the certificate itself and the original certificate before allowing them to start in their role. The reasons for this is, although the system will flag up if that person's got any offences relating that show up on their DBS, sometimes errors happen and we won't receive a flag to let us know. So as a double check, we need to be seeing that DBS certificate for everyone, employees as well, before they start in their new role. So we would require them to bring that DBS certificate in, and someone, usually administration team, would check to make sure that that's all clear. It's worth noting you're not allowed to take a copy of people's DBS certificates. So it's just a visual check, and to make sure that you then note on the single central record under column I and J that you've seen that. So moving on to the next section, which is the S128 check. Oh, no, yeah, sorry. The S128 check, volunteers are not subject to this check. As I previously mentioned regarding heads and people in senior leadership team, they are, and the same as with governors. So all governors will have had an S128 check to make sure that they are allowed to work within the management of schools. So once you've completed this, you would then note the date that you completed this. There isn't any way to evidence that you've completed this in terms of printing something off. Some schools I've been into have actually printed off the list of people that are on that. We're not allowed to do that because of data protection. So it's just about evidencing by putting in a date that you've checked that. With references, about 18 months ago, Ian put together a new volunteers policy. In that policy, it does state that we have to get 2 satisfactory references for volunteers. Obviously, with COVID, it's unlikely that there will be many volunteers showing up on the school single central record that will have reference dates in them, just because they've obviously not been in school during COVID. But going forward, any new staff, any new volunteers and any new governors will be required to provide 2 referees, and a template for this will be sent out to schools for them to send out to the referees to get those references back. Once the references come back, you just have to input the date that they were received. And sometimes it might be that they can't provide professional references. They may have been retired for the last 10 years. So there's so many different scenarios that can happen, but something that they could do would be seeking a reference from a professional person as a personal reference, maybe someone within their church, or an accountant, or those kind of people. So if you have any questions regarding references for governors and for volunteers, then please email me or Ian, and we'll endeavour to answer those. Once those references have come back, obviously you enter the date, and then again you need to put who the evidence has been checked by. This will usually be the administration team, and they just need to put in their name as a reference. Okay.
Thanks for that. Any questions on volunteers? As Hannah said, this part does sit within the school, and we're available for advice, but it's for school staff to take the lead on. So if you've got any questions about that, volunteers, governors. Amy has. Go, Amy.
Sorry, I couldn't find the hands up bit. I've got 2. Sorry. Earlier you mentioned about under 16s not being DBS checked. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Do they then have to still go through the same process as a volunteer, and do they have to be then escorted around the school?
No. So what happens, it's completely different for children coming in from different schools. Usually this is a work placement, so work experience placement. So there's actually a separate risk assessment that goes on with the head teacher, that happens between the pupil, the head teacher, and also the head teacher from the school that they've come from. They're not recorded on the single central record, but they are recorded in terms of a risk assessment that's done separately.
How come that? Sorry, I don't know. How come they're not recorded on, if their placement's over a term, for example? How come they're not recorded on the
so someone under 16 wouldn't be on a placement for a term. Someone under 16 still in education, so therefore they wouldn't be able to have a DBS check, and also they're in education themselves.
I don't know. I just was like, I don't know. Okay. I don't know. I haven't.
No, that's fine.
It's a great question, Amy, and I think as well, the other side of this is that that's another child coming into the school in the eyes of the law. So there's also some safeguarding responsibilities that the school has while having that child there.
Cool. That makes sense. That makes total sense. I understand now. Thank you. And if you had a volunteer coming in, and maybe they're not coming in on a regular thing, like a weekly basis, but they're kind of coming quite sporadically. With supply teachers, you said if there's after 3 months, if they haven't been supplying after 3 months, or they choose not to come in, like you were saying before, then you have to go through the whole process again. Would the same be for volunteers? Is there a cut-off period where if volunteers haven't been in the school for, say, 3 months, then they have to go through the whole process again?
So with a volunteer, it's about communication, and it's about the head teacher having overall kind of a decision on it. If a volunteer was coming in regularly and then stopped coming in, it's about having those conversations with that person as to why they've stopped coming in and whether they will be coming in regularly again, or if there's anything that's preventing them from. If it's really done by a case-by-case basis, but if they weren't in for a substantial amount of time, it might be best to re-DBS them. There's only an admin charge that's attached to this, or something that we are now trying to promote within schools is I recently discovered that any volunteering role, so volunteers and governors, can subscribe for free. So what we would be asking people within schools that are completing DBS, the DBS process for volunteers and governors, is to ask them to also subscribe to the update service, because there's no charge. You have to do this within a 30-day period of receiving that DBS certificate. But if they did that, then you could then, if they hadn't been in for a period of time, you could just check on the update service and you wouldn't receive any kind of, financial penalty for doing that, because it's free.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah.
Thanks. Lucy has a question.
I just wanted to ask about student teachers. So we currently have a couple of student teachers here for, well, they're here twice a week for a couple of weeks, and then they're going to be here for a month. And we just had like the checks from the university, and they are 19, so obviously they're over 18. Check the ID and all that. Do they need to be on the single centre record for the time they're here?
So with people that are like placement, they would come under agency because they're coming in, but they're employed or they're with a different organisation. So you would either expect to see a letter of assurance from them to say that they've been DBS checked, but also requesting to see their DBS as well. Okay. But they would come under agency. You wouldn't be required to do all the checks yourself.
No. Yeah, but they go under agency. Okay.
Would, yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. It's similar to one from Caroline in the chat. We have placements for a local college and achievement training for people doing NVQs in childcare. They normally come with a DBS from their provider. Can we take these existing DBS? Do they need to be listed? Do they need references? I think the answer is going to be the same, isn't it? They're covered by the provider. And I'm not going to say anymore because I'm going to let you talk about contractors and agencies, if that's all right.
Yeah, we will go through it, but again, they would go under the agency tab. So the references doesn't apply, which you'll see in the next part.
Brilliant. Okay, let's go to that tab then. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the contractors tab. So when the best way to think about whether they should be in the contractors tab or the agency tab is anything to do with the premises. So the building, the grounds, anything to do with that would be contractors. So we're talking about plumbers, electricians, gardeners, cleaners. They would all come under the contractors tab. And then what a lot of companies are doing, especially if they're quite large companies and they have numerous employees, instead of providing their DBS certificate, proof of their DBS certificate for each employee coming out, they provide now a letter of assurance, and that states that anyone visiting schools from their company has an enhanced DBS. So what we would do is we would request to see that some companies will list who has enhanced DBS certificates. So if that is the case, we need to make sure that when someone from that company comes into the school, when we're checking their ID, we're also checking that they're on our letter of assurance if they've individually listed their employees. If they haven't and it's just a blanket letter, then it's just a case of checking their ID to make sure that they are from that company. If for some reason someone turned up that wasn't scheduled to come and they had an ID from, say, Cannings, it's just because it wasn't scheduled and they weren't expected. I think it's good practice to then phone that company just to make sure that they are meant to be here and the reasons behind it, and also to let them know in future any kind of any visits need to be booked, prior to them visiting. So once you have those letter of assurances, it's good practice to try and get an up-to-date one each year. So when I worked in a school office, I worked in school offices for about 8 years, and after a while I developed like an annual calendar to show kind of what I need to do in each month. And I used to put for October, don't know why, to re-request letters of assurances, and then just update that. Again, like we said with volunteers and governors, having those separate files, you could also, you need a separate file for contractors, and again for agency, and you need to just have a copy of those letters of assurances or proof that you've checked their DBS certificates. You should not be, again, taking a copy of their DBS certificate because we're not allowed, but you could then put those on electronically as well. And then once we've received that information, we're just entering it on to the SCR to say we've got a letter of assurance when we've seen it. If it's an individual where it says date ID seen, then we would state that if it was a DBS certificate, and then who's checked it. Next tab, please, Ian. Thank you. So the next tab is agency. So agency staff are kind of all the other kind of people that aren't involved in the premises. So examples of this would be supply staff from supply agencies like Hayes, music teachers that aren't directly employed by the school, school nursing teams, ed psychs, Babcock, sports coaches, anything to do with pupils, the curriculum, teachers, staff, those kind of people would then come under this tab. And again, it's just seeing if they've got a letter of assurance. If they have, popping that onto the system and keeping a copy of that. If not, we would hope that these kind of people that tend to move around schools, especially like music teachers, sports coaches, they'll work at various schools. We would like to see that they are, they have updated, subscribed to the update service. So you'd need to see a copy of their DBS certificate to ensure that it's clear first. And then you can then do the relevant checks on the update service. And the information you need to complete an update service check is you need to see their DBS certificate. And once you've seen that, you can then note their certificate number, their date of birth and their surname. And that's all you need in order to complete those checks. I record my checks, so I will snip that I've done a check. It will give you like a little screen saying you've checked this person's DBS and it's clear. It doesn't give any information. So I'll use the snip tool as evidence that I've done that check, but it's not required. That's just something that I do. So that's where you would then log this. Again, like you mentioned with colleges, they would come under this tab because they're working within the curriculum with the children. So they would be mentioned under this one. And that's that one. I do need to mention as well, just because someone might not have a DBS or a letter of assurance doesn't mean they can't come into the school. It just means that they have to be supervised at all times. So if you had a burst pipe and you had to call a plumber that you don't normally use, they can come in and they don't have to appear on the single central record, but you just have to supervise them at all times to make sure that the children and everyone are safe. So yeah, so that's that tab.
Okay, contractors, agencies. I'll tell you, the hours I've spent in schools discussing the differences between those two groups. Thank you for that, Hannah. I would add that all trust employees are trust employees. So we're on our single central record. We don't count as contractors or agencies because we're family. as it were. I think Amy might have a question.
Oh, Ian, you're getting to know me so well. Obviously, I'm taking from this that the letter of assurance for contractors is the school's responsibility.
Yeah,
to obtain that.
yeah. So the school is responsible for getting a copy, for obtaining copies of letter of assurances, and also storing them as evidence. Something I didn't mention, which I should, is people that are self-employed cannot provide letters of assurances. They can't say that I'm DBS checked, and so it's worth noting if they're self-employed, they can't provide a letter of assurance to assure themselves as DBS checked. They'd have to physically show us their DBS.
That's fine, because obviously we've just changed from TDA, so I need to take that back to make sure the contractors we've got now are all of that. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Although saying that, I think the estates team are managing it on our behalf. So I'll take that forward and find that out, because then would it fall to their responsibility to get those insurance checks?
It might do. To be honest, I'm not too sure what the responsibilities of the estates team are. I think I do know that they do have a look at single central record and flag if we're using a contractor and then not appearing on the single central record. So it might just be like another audit trail or someone checking.
I'll take that forward.
Right.
Lovely. Any more questions on contractors, agencies? If you think of something, you can always ask at the end. Do you want to mention the training tab there, Hannah?
Yep, so we do have the training tab, which Ian is just about to show. We recommend, although it's on our single central record, we recommend that you don't use this. You can use the actual format, but have it stored separately. Most schools have their own separate spreadsheet to record the various different training that happens for all the roles. But it's not a requirement for Ofsted to see this as part of the single central record. Therefore, it's best that we don't have this on our single central record and it be stored separately. Not to say that Ofsted won't ask to see your training records, but it's just, if they're not asking, let's not make it available. Just to make this easy.
Okay, right. Hannah, that's been fantastically helpful, as always, and please do add some more questions to the chat or pop up if you've got any questions about that. I just want to talk briefly about responsibilities, because the big change this year is that the single central record is now shared between the central team and yourselves, and like the question Amy raised about letters of assurance, it's easy to assume somebody else is doing that, so I don't need to worry. A lot of roads do lead back to the head, because the head is the leader of the school. The head is usually the designated safeguarding lead. So, onus on heads to assure themselves that even if somebody else is supposed to be doing something, are they doing it? Have we got a single central record we could stand behind in the event of an inspection? So I've got a simple sheet which will come out to you if I can find it. There it is. And what we've done is looked at some of the different roles. You seen that, Hannah?
Yep.
Yep. So here's Hannah in the middle. In between cups of coffee, she completes all the safe recruitment checks. She's maintaining and updating all the single central records for every school and centrally. She's adding joiners, removing leavers, checking periodically against the personnel records, and supporting schools in the event of recruitment, and also in the event of an inspection or an external audit. If you've had John Galling in recently, Hannah most likely would have popped up to talk through the staff section of the single central record too. So really vital role that she's playing. Either side of that, staff in school, as we've said, it's the volunteers, the governors, contractors, agencies, visitors, your entry, exit, the front of house safeguarding element all sits within the school. So Hannah and myself are available for advice on those things, as would Fiona be within her pupil service lead role. But it's really within the school to enact the policies as we have them and to carry out those processes. There may be a need, also there will be a need here to keep your own records that back up your sections, whether that's in paper or electronic, that you have got evidence of your volunteer recruitment, your governor recruitment. You can put your hands on the letter of assurance that your SCR references. That again will be on the schools to do. We can provide support and guidance on how, but that sits within the school. And at times it is possible that although Hannah can do many things, she can't be in 2 schools at once. If we've got a lot of recruitment going on, it may be that staff in schools are asked to help with collecting ID, evidence of teaching qualifications and other documents at that point of recruitment, to keep that all moving forward smoothly. So that would be the exception rather than the rule, but that is something that we may need help with, because if somebody's come in for an interview, they're with you. That's a great time to take copies, scan them and send them on Hannah's behalf. So there is a role for pupil service leads, which we are reviewing in the light of the fact that we're also introducing some ops leads into the system. My view is that going forward, in the same way as Hannah's there to support you with the staff side of things, pupil services leads will be there to support you with your parts that you're working on of the single central record. This is really key one here, because the expectations of leaders and governors are very different. Heads are very hands-on. I'd be expecting heads to keep on top of their single central record, both the bits that Hannah's doing and the bits that your school staff are doing, because it's your document and it's reflecting your school. So checking in at least termly, and also making sure that your office staff have got time to complete their parts of it as well. Now, if you've not checked an SCR before, you'll find in the Teams safeguarding section in your secure area my most recent single central record check. It's a little while ago now, but that might be a good place to start. You could look at how it was on that visit, what the actions were then, have those actions been carried out. The other place you can look for where to start is John Galling's most recent visit note. And going forwards, we're intending to put together a schedule for you that you can use for the termly checking, and keep on top of any actions that were arising. Over time, the number of actions and the significance of the actions should massively reduce. Right now, if you've not been collecting references for volunteers and you've got to start that ball rolling, then it's going to be a bit of work at the moment. If you're joining us as a new school and you don't have references for a lot of your staff, there's going to be quite a big job to do in doing all those risk assessments. But most of the schools, the journey we've been on over the last couple of years, we've really worked at this, and there shouldn't ever now be anything huge or anything particularly surprising that you'll have to do. It's making sure that you just check. Governors, your role is to check the checkers, to check that the checking has been happening, and some of that's about asking the right questions. We've got a safeguarding governors toolkit with really good questions on it, the right things to be asking. And in the past, it might have been that safeguarding governors will come and look at the single central record with the business manager or whoever in school. Sometimes that wasn't very helpful because the governor hadn't had the kind of training you've had this morning. So really, I'll be expecting the safeguarding governor to sit with the head and say, right, tell me about checking, what you found out. Can you show me this? Can you show me that this section 128 checks have been done? Can you show me the file for your most recent employee? Just to be checking on the checking. That's really what we're after from school leaders. Myself, John Galling, internal audit, Ofsted, we provide that additional external layer. And really that's about sharpening best practice, ensuring fidelity to policy, and also capturing any changes. What I've learned over the last few years is legislation changes quite frequently. What once wasn't mandatory becomes mandatory, and then we've got a bit of work to do to catch up. So that's really the role of the external auditors. This document will come out with the rest of the documents after today's training for you, and it just gives you that handy reference so you know where you fit in. So I'm going to stop share. Any questions on roles and responsibilities? I can see Claire.
Just you said about obviously, I'm thinking about termly checking. I did it with my safeguarding governor, and it's coming up time for me to do it again. Looking at the last one, 519, I'm thinking, should I use the same format? Should I just do a copy of that?
You could actually, you could open the same document. You could add a column with a new date, and just have it as a follow-up. That would be useful in the interim. Absolutely. And when you looked at it with your safeguarding governor before, did you involve Hannah in that?
No, because I did it with just the governor, and then quite soon after that we had the meeting with John, which Hannah was at.
You did, okay. So yeah, sorry, I should know, did John's visit result in any actions around the single central record?
I don't think so.
Don't think so, no. So yeah, you can either start from John's last visit or from the last one that I did, but I'm happy to chat to you between now and then, Claire, if that would be helpful as well. All right.
I think it's just that kind of, yeah, I think it's just that having a kind of a pro forma of what I should be looking for when we audit, and I can go through with the governor.
Okay, well, I'll send you that governor's question list, because I think you'll find that very helpful.
And then I don't know, did you mention, Ian, that we're putting together for September? It will be a termly, so it'd be covering an annual cycle, academic year, but there'll be termly opportunities to tick what you've checked and any actions going forward. So you'll have like a working document through the academic year from September to evidence when you've checked it and who's been involved in that.
Okay,
That'd be perfect.